Hi, this is the Theory of Moral Sentiments for Beginners. He published the first edition in 1759 and the final edition in 1790, the year that he died. What does Smith mean by sentiment is a good question. Feeling, emotion, passion. And here are something I pulled off the web: happy, excited, scared, angry, sad. I'd say that those terms describe a person with a sentiment, perhaps rather than the sentiment itself. The sentiment itself would be, say, happiness or joy, cheer, if excitement. So someone who feels excitement is excited. Someone who feels anger is angry, and so on. So the sentiment is the thing he's talking about here. Also on the web, I found this feelings wheel: happy, fear, and so on. And this wheel gets larger and larger. So you can list a whole lot of different sentiments to talk about. You could think of it as an experience that you have. Are there other experiences that are not sentiments? Perception, an impression, a thought, idea, image, logic, reason. Are they other than sentiment? Are they something other than sentiment? I think we often talk as though they are, certainly. So sentiment isn't everything necessarily. Now, sentiments often concern an object. Here's a woman beholding a vast expanse, sunset on the landscape. So the object there is the scene that she's beholding. Here's another woman beholding a cat, enjoying rubbing its face against the grass. There are many distinctions we can make among sentiments. For example, fleeting sentiment versus enduring. And if it's enduring, we might say perhaps mood or attitude. Passive versus active. Pleasurable versus painful. Positive, negative. Calm or violent. Expected, unexpected. Regarding the past, say nostalgia, wistfulness, regret, remorse. The present, confidence, anguish. The future, hope, dread. Another type of distinction comes with the type of object. After all, it's called the theory of moral sentiments. And the object here for moral sentiments is human. Now, it's not, oh, the guy's got a handsome face, so it's a moral sentiment. And it's not, I like that she's got beautiful eyes, so it's a moral sentiment. No, in particular, it's human conduct or character. Those are some broader terms. Some of the facets or aspects are human action, motives, intentions, purposes, manner, behavior. Smith often speaks of conduct, and then the sort of sets of conduct or purposes a person seems to feel is important, forming their character or describing their character. So moral sentiments are sentiments about the beauty of human conduct or character. Is there any moral sentiment here? She's beholding the landscape. However, a moment later, she, in a sense, can behold herself. She can behold the sentiment she just felt about the landscape. And so that sentiment of hers a moment ago is a kind of human conduct. And so it's very easy to get moral sentiment into all sentiments because we feel moment by moment, and in the next moment we can reflect on how we just felt and what feelings we let ourselves had or indulged in, and so on. So moral sentiment is really pretty pervasive. Indeed, when we have perceptions, impressions, thoughts, ideas, and so on, we can then reflect on our feeling those sentiments and our commitments, our attitudes about them. So moral sentiment is really very, very pervasive. And I'd say that's one of the kind of things that you're getting from Smith's great book. Now I want to turn to another distinction, passive, active. So passive is more, maybe you're sitting on your own and you're observing something or reflecting on something or reading the newspaper, and it doesn't particularly stir you towards action, whereas active has more of a sense of impelling you towards some kind of action. And Smith doesn't strictly associate emotions with passive and passions with active, but there's reason to say that this is a fair fit. And it's certainly not an unusual association with each word that emotion is more passive and passion is more active. So I think it's a good way to think. And then let's do a little scheme here also with positive and negative. So passive emotions that are positive, this is again moral sentiments towards somebody's behavior, right? Liking or love, like I love, that actor or that comic or that athlete or what have you. Disliking and hatred would be the negative for Smith. And then active, a big one for positive is gratitude. You feel grateful actually toward the person, and the gratitude kind of moves you to want to return the help or the benefit or the good office that you got somehow, even if it's just saying thank you or expressing your gratitude. And the negative is resentment. You feel kind of hurt or perhaps injured by what the person did, and you feel kind of moved to kind of return hurt for hurt, or maybe insult for insult or something like that. So you get these different schemes with these different distinctions. Something Smith says about passive and active, I think, is noteworthy. He says that our passive feelings are almost always so sordid and so selfish. That's not to say that they're terribly base or something necessarily, but they're concerned with ourself. We're not thinking so much about other people, that we're passive. Maybe we're concerned about our comfort or even our serenity. And that's maybe all he means by selfish, just sort of how we're feeling here. Whereas active, when we're acting, we more think about the responsibilities we have to others, and that arouses things in us. And so our active sentiments are often so generous and so noble. This is an interesting way to think about it, because if you think you're going to take more control of your sentiments and be more sort of active about them, that might inspire generosity and nobility, as it were, in your conduct. And you might want to look for activities and situations that put you in a more active role. Now, a very big term for Smith is sympathy. So what's that about? He calls it fellow feeling, but it's not just fellow feeling with sorrow. It could also be with joy. So it's with any feeling, whatever, okay? Any sentiment, whatever. It involves two beings. For example, two persons, let's call them Jim and Mary. Sympathy between Jim and Mary. Now, Knud Hawkinson makes a nice dissection of sympathy, which I think is really useful. So we're thinking about Jim being the person principally concerned in some situation, experiencing maybe a problem, and Mary entering into Jim's situation, sympathizing with Jim. Step one, Mary enters into Jim's situation. She does this with her imagination. It's kind of like stepping into Jim's shoes, as we say. She then, in that imagined situation, experiences a sentiment. So, in this kind of vicarious, imagined experience, a sentiment rises up in her. And then third, she compares her sentiment to the sentiment which Jim is expressing or displaying, okay? And this gives rise to a new sentiment based on what that comparison results in. If she sees a similitude, a sameness between her sentiment and Jim's sentiment, that creates a new positive, pleasurable sentiment, sort of agreement. Whereas if she sees a significant difference or clash, a displeasure, a kind of pain, you might say, and maybe disagreement, and maybe therefore sort of a disapproval of Jim. So this is a kind of 4-step dissection, and the complete experience of sympathy is entering into doing the comparison and finding that there's agreement. So that's kind of like the full consummation of sympathy. Now, let's say Jim is acting and we're observing him. Let's say a number of us are observing him. Maybe it's a film clip, maybe it's a YouTube clip, and we can all watch it and kind of react to it. So Smith uses the idea of propriety in a significant way in the book. And let me explain what that is. So in terms of entering now, we're kind of seeing Jim, do something and thinking about how much we agree with Jim's conduct, how much we approve of it. If we are going to probably give somewhat different answers, okay, or different reactions and different explanations if we try to explain our reactions. And that's what this wavy kind of, vague, wavy line, kind of loose, vague, and indeterminate shape is about here. So if we go around the room, one person will say, I thought Jim was here, and one person said, I thought his behavior was here. And this is in terms of some sort of like virtue upward, vice downward, or praise upward, blame downward, approbation upward, disapprobation downward. So around the room, there's going to be some disagreement. But within a reference group, within a kind of community or imagined group of who you think is judging this, some community, let's say J, just to kind of indicate that these communities can differ in time and place, in age group, in experience, and expertise, or what have you, whatever your standard is. It's kind of like sports. There's different levels. There's the major leagues and there's the minor leagues. There's AA, there's single A, there's high school baseball. And so, there's different levels of what's considered good, right? Like if Jim's behaving and he's a 12-year-old, we're not going to hold him to the same standards as if he's a 22-year-old, right? So this notion of, what we think is proper, fair to middling, you could say, Smith calls propriety. And then above propriety is praiseworthy. That's in this reference group J, okay, or if you like, community J. And below, blameworthy, okay? You might also say, approval, disapproval, smile, frown, kind of thing, okay? So propriety is that fair to middling, which is neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy in this analysis. Now, let's say Jim's behavior involves showing some courage as opposed to cowardice in particular. So there would be some sense of propriety of, oh, he showed more than just fair to middling amount of courage. and so he's praiseworthy. Or maybe he shows less than fair to middling, and he's blameworthy. But, you can also consider another kind of problem that Jim might have, and that's that he's too presumptuously rash in moving forward and taking action even. So this could be rashness versus courage. And this would be a different picture like this, but it would be the same general idea. But it's a different distinction going on, where now the concern is that Jim was overly rash and kind of like butting in, offending people, upsetting things with his so-called courage. He imagines himself courageous, but maybe he's being rash. And so here again, we have, he could be praiseworthy and being properly courageous versus blameworthy now of being too rash, okay? And so what we've just done is seen that in a sense, there's virtue of courage, and on either side, there's kind of a deficiency of this stepping up, cowardice, and then there's an excess of stepping up, this kind of rashness, presumptuousness. And so this is something that Smith points out, and he connects this to Aristotle, who said that virtue kind of lies in between the vice of deficiency and the vice of excess. Smith gives 3 examples of this virtue vice thing. And so courage with cowardice and rashness on either side, like we just spoke of. So there'd be a propriety, there's a propriety idea here that's fair to middling, below would be blameworthy, and above would be praiseworthy. And then it rises and falls where beyond another propriety level here of fair to middling, it becomes blameworthy with rashness. And then another example he gives is frugality, the virtue of frugality, where you responsibly think about and mind how much you're spending. And if you don't mind it much, there's a deficiency of mindfulness in that, then you might do profusion. And if you're overly mindful, kind of penny pinching, avarice, then there's magnanimity, kind of bigness of soul. And then there's pusillanimity, if you kind of shrink from the situation, and arrogance, if you, again, are kind of presumptuously rash and flashy. So this kind of thing you can think of in this picture. Now, if we put the praiseworthiness and blameworthiness along the vertical, you see the rising virtue in the middle. And on either side, there's a fair to middling point where it moves from praiseworthy to blameworthy. And so this is vice, virtue, vice. Okay. And Smith sometimes uses the expression mediocrity in here. And when he uses that, you got to think of it a little differently than he means kind of a middle range here. And, you're stepping up. It's not mediocre that we might use the term so much of kind of not impressive. It's just kind of a middle range. So virtues. We talked about some just now, and you could talk about many, many others, and you could define them very narrowly. How about dental hygiene? That could be like an aspect of hygiene, but you could just focus on dental hygiene. And again, you could have a deficiency, you could have virtue, and then you could have an excess of someone who minds and puts too much time and effort and attention into their dental hygiene. So we just talked about these 3. Courage, fortitude might be associated with courage. We talked about frugality, magnanimity, and there's many, many others. Some of the notable ones in the book are prudence, temperance, beneficence, charity, friendship, and others, of course. But there are many, many. If you go to the web, you could find different presentations and categorizations. And I was just looking, and here's a so-called master list of virtues, and this is just A through I. So, I think all this is all good to think about all these different things you can kind of see as virtues and treat in these virtue lenses that Smith is giving us. Now, there's a particular lens I want to share that Smith provides, just one, one of numerous, and it's between amiable, and I'm going to associate that with Mary in this telling, and respectable, Jim, who isn't looking terribly respectable there in that picture, but that's what duty calls for him to do here. So let's focus on Jim for a second. I want to give this picture. This is all just Jim. Now, what is this? This is a spiral of Jim's being, I guess you could say. And it starts up here in the moment, in the present, the self-engaged, kind of an impulse, going to work, getting to work. Meanwhile, straightening up the kitchen and getting the kids to school and who knows what else. And he really feels like perhaps stopping off at the golf course. I mean, I don't know, but you know how it is. Different impulses pull us in different ways. So these are actually multiple and in conflict, okay? So this is this kind of disintegration side. And to deal with that, he's somehow got to manage these multiple impulses, if you will, passions, you could say, certainly. And to do that, he somehow manages them. He somehow commands some, maybe he subdues some, and develops, certain habits or commitments to create a more composed, enduring self, okay? But even in composed, enduring selves, thinking now more about the day-by-day routines and practices of the month or whatever, can be in conflict. Should he stay in his job? Should he stay, in this situation in this way and that way? Should he pursue certain career changes, different intellectual interests, hobbies, and so on, whatever, maybe habits like smoking or drinking, and these conflict, right? And so again, he comes back to conflict here and the need to kind of pull himself together. And so here you on the integration side, he tries to deal with this again to create a more underlying coherent self and so on. Okay, I don't think this comes to any particular ending here. But the point here is that while Jim is going through, this whole drama of experience, Mary, his friend, is entering into his situation. And Mary, in doing so now, she understands that Jim is, having some trouble. And to help Jim and to sympathize with him, she needs to enter into this disintegration side of Jim, okay? Meanwhile, Jim, to help Mary enter into his situation, needs to buck up somewhat, right, to pull himself together, because if he's just a total mess, sitting down here without too much hope, as a conflicted mess, she's not going to be that willing to dwell in his problem. So he needs to buck up to try to, meet her halfway, as it were. And this is exactly what Smith says. So he speaks of these two different sets of virtue. This is a quote. First, the Mary ones, these amiable, the soft, the gentle, the amiable virtues, the virtues of candid condensation and indulgent humanity are founded upon one set of virtues. And then the other, the great, the awful, that meant awesome, and respectable, the virtues of self-denial, of self-government, and that command of the passions, which subjects all the movements of our nature to what our own dignity and honor and the propriety of our own conduct require, take their origin from the other set of virtues. So this distinction between amiable and respectable is quite important in the work. It comes kind of early in the book. And while he's emphasizing these different virtues to help us harmonize our sentiments, to sympathize with each other, the one entering into and compassionate, the other one kind of showing dignity and respectability, to meet the person halfway. He says very, very clearly that upward growth requires both. So you can't just focus on the one. You have to do both. It's kind of like a upward spiral, you could say. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, after all, if Mary is going to enter into Jim's situation, part of Jim's situation is his need to buck up. So she has to think about the difficulty of Jim bucking up in Jim's situation. And so she needs to imagine what it's like to buck up in that situation. So she kind of needs to know the respectable virtues. And likewise for Jim to kind of enable Mary to enter in, he needs to think about what it's like to be amiable. So by understanding the demands of amiability, if you will, he'll be better able to help her enter into by bucking up. So you see, it's very much a kind of yin yang kind of thing. And again, you want to kind of go upward. Upward is associated with virtue. Now, there's another virtue that we are all to practice, and it's commutative justice. I say commutative because there are two other kinds of justice in Smith, and this is just to make clear that we're talking about this one. And Smith says that the most sacred laws of this kind of justice are those which call on us not to mess with our neighbor's life and person, property and possessions, and promises due. Okay. And this is a quite special virtue. He describes it at one point as abstaining from what is another's, your neighbor's person, property, promises due. Now, I like to put this in another formulation. I like to say not messing with other people's stuff, and I encourage you to think about that expression. I just want to show you that it maps perfectly here to abstaining from what is another's. You just have to change the words around a little bit or the order. So abstaining from is not messing with. And see, I think a virtue of saying not messing with is that it enables us here to put the not aside and focus then on, okay, what counts as messing? You see, really kind of, okay, what is messing? And these are sort of jurisprudence questions, right? And then we have stuff for what, and stuff, remember, includes promises due. So it's not always tangible stuff, like a coffee mug. It's also promises due from consent and contract. And then is another's is other people's. What makes it other people's? Whose is it? And so on. So I think this not messing with other people's stuff parses more nicely, lends itself to analysis better. Now, we saw that propriety involved loose, vague, and indeterminate rules and a sense of propriety and so on. That's one type of set of rules for a virtue, and in fact, almost all of the virtues are like that. They have rules that are loose, vague, and indeterminate, Smith says. However, there is one virtue whose rules, he says, are precise and accurate. So we can put that in here where we have these that are loose, vague, and indeterminate. And then there is the one, and that one is commutative justice, whose rules are precise and accurate. The rules about what counts as messing with your neighbor's stuff, like if his car is parked outside his home, are quite precise and accurate. In fact, the rules of property evolve to be quite precise and accurate. They provide a kind of social grammar. And so when we go around the room and say, did Jim mess with, his neighbor's stuff, we'll all basically give the same answer is the idea. And when we give the same answer and there's not this kind of controversy or uncertainty, it's more reasonable then to, mete out punishment for messing with people's stuff because the community agrees and so forth. So this is a different kind of virtue, actually, because it is the only one whose rules are like this. And this makes it quite special among the virtues. That is to say, commutative justice is quite special. And here what we see is, rules for conduct, morals, which is, what Smith is treating in the book. There's commutative justice, and then there's all other virtues. And this distinction is parallel to rules for writing. Grammar is precise and accurate, whereas the rules of criticism, aesthetics, are loose, vague, and indeterminate. Whoops. And just like this, for commutative justice, you really don't get praise for getting your grammar right. The only feedback is negative, just as here, you don't get praise for doing commutative justice. In fact, it doesn't really mean anything to go above commutative justice. You can't, if you're not messing with other people's stuff, you can't do more than not mess. I mean, you can in the other virtues, but not as far as commutative justice goes. But when you fall short, you get criticism and you get into trouble. Just like when you violate grammar, it's considered grammatical mistakes and you get marked down on it, but you don't get marked up for getting your grammar right, at least not beyond grammar school. So whereas here, the feedback is negative and positive, praiseworthy, blameworthy. Here, it's only negative. And so this is an important thing in Smith. And this relates to the government as a special player, a kind of superior in these jural relationships of rights and duties of this sort. That's what the word jural means, kind of like jurisprudence. And so whereas the book is focused mostly on relationships between you and your neighbor, you and your coworkers, you and your employer or employees, and other equal jural relationships, there is also the superior inferior, that is the governor governed, which plays a role in the book, to be sure, but that there are these two relationships, two jural relationships is a very important thing to understand. And Smith just presupposes it. Okay. Now, let me also note that in addition to virtue, which we've talked some about, Smith often couples wisdom. And I just want you to be aware of that. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because to do what's virtuous, you kind of have to know what's right. So wisdom, knowledge, we associate wisdom with knowledge. To do what's right, you have to know what's right. And indeed, to know what's right, how do you know things? Learning by doing. You have to do what's right. So, and he very much associates virtue with habit. And so if you're in the habit of doing, what's virtuous, you have that experience and hence that wisdom about how it plays out in the different situations and what sort of the loose, vague, and indeterminate fine points are, and so on. So he couples wisdom and virtue about 22 times in the book. So earlier, I explained that sympathy is fellow feelings among two beings. For example, we spoke of Jim and Mary. And I just want to point out that beings are not always persons of this nature, like we can take photographs of exactly. And in particular, Smith talks about the conscience, okay? And for Jim's conscience, he casts that as a kind of being. And his name for that is Jim's man within the breast. So in a way, he's projecting a being within you, your conscience, and then that can be the being with whom you sympathize, or that sympathizes with you, acting in the moment, living your life. So that's really, really important. It's really important to understand that sympathy is not always like one person to another person. It can be one person to an imagined person or being. It could be someone from the past. You could be imagining whether Adam Smith would sympathize with you. Maybe it's your mother or your father who is now passed away, deceased, but you still have a sense of their, moral judgment, their sensibilities, and whether they would sympathize with you, be in sympathy with you, and so on. So this is very important. And I want to point out that in talking about this, he distinguishes the impartial spectator and the man within the breast. In acting virtuously, he says, the man is always both supported and rewarded by the entire approbation of the impartial spectator and of the representative of the impartial spectator, the man within the breast. So these are distinguished, and in fact, something of a relationship is indicated here. The man within the breast is Jim's representative of this impartial spectator. Okay. Now, as we all know, representatives are not necessarily good representatives. Consciences are not necessarily great. I mean, they're our better self and certainly our hope for upward movement. But that doesn't mean that our consciences are great or perfect. They might be quite flawed in the eyes of this impartial spectator, of which the man within the breast is but a representative. Okay. In fact, sometimes he speaks of the man within the breast as the supposed impartial spectator. We kind of presume that our conscience is impartial, but it's supposed. It's like, okay, you got to give it a little skepticism, sometimes a lot of skepticism. So he says supposed. And this brings us to finally the fact that some of the words in Smith are Polysemes, which is to say they have more than one meaning. And when they do, it's not about seeing what Smith's preferred meaning is and discarding the others. It's generally about distinguishing between the meanings and seeing which one he means at the time, in the particular text. He generally affirms the different meanings. So it's about understanding the numerous meanings and sorting between them and figuring out which one you should see in the usage of the word in any particular spot. And as we've seen, impartial spectator is one of the Polysemes terms in the theory of moral sentiments. It can be some kind of high godlike being or God itself. It can be the conscience. It can be just someone who happens to be on the scene and seems to be, well, first of all, is spectating, but also seems to be impartial as far as the parties concerned go. It could be maybe exemplar, someone particularly admired that influences you, someone who you kind of bring into your breast. So the impartial spectator has several meanings. They're related, but they're different. Justice, as I've mentioned, has three meanings. And also, I haven't mentioned this, but be aware that nature and natural has multiple meanings. And that's very, very common, of course, in works of this kind, that the word nature has numerous meanings. And so that's about it, folks. So I hope you enjoy TMS. I hope this was helpful, and thank you very much for your attention.